Welcome back, Twin Cities Startup Week Sales and Marketing Track. We are on to our second panel in terms of podcasting, and we're going to focus really on marketing. So I want to welcome back Tim, co-founder and partner at the Mahonis Group, and looking forward to another great panel. Thank you, guys.
To thunderous applause. All right, here we go. Welcome back to the, I don't need this anymore, do I? Take that off. Welcome back to Twin Cities Podcast Hosts Unplugged. Again, my name is Tim Bornholdt. Thank you. The cameraman clapped for me. I appreciate it. We're here this hour to talk about marketing. So I'm really glad that we've got another all-star panel to join us, all hosts of shows, well, most of us hosts of shows, in the Twin Cities area. So why don't we go one at a time. We'll just start down at the end, and we'll introduce yourself, what you do for your day job, and what your podcast is all about.
My name is Levitt. I am the owner of Studio Americana. We produce podcasts and audiobooks for a number of clients. I'm not currently recording my own podcast, though. Jenna and I did one called the Studio Podcast that was all about nuts and bolts of getting your podcast started. But our team is all about working all the technical details, some of the stuff talked about in the previous panel, just those details, the editing, the recording, making sure everything's nice and polished. We take care of those details so podcasters can work on booking guests and making a good show.
I'm Jenna Redfield. I am the host of the Collective Marketing Podcast. My podcast has several names over the last several years. And I work at a business I started called Twin Cities Collective. I'm a marketing coach, and also I put on a lot of events and workshops in the Twin Cities and virtually. And that's what I do. And I also work with Ian at Studio Americana. I do their marketing, and it's been really fun.
I'm Kurt Schmidt, president and partner at Foundry, where we design and build software. And I'm host of Schmidt List, which is a podcast and a live stream that I've been doing for the last 4 years.
Hi, I'm Jessica Meyer. I am the co-host of Women in Tech Twin Cities, along with Anna Bliss and Paith Philmon. Our podcast is focused on gender equity and bringing up the voices of women working in the tech industry here in the Twin Cities. My day job, I actually have two. I'm a principal data scientist at Optum, as well as a teaching assistant for Columbia University.
My name's Kevin McArdle. My day job is founder and CEO of SureSwift Capital. We acquire and operate small technology businesses. One of those businesses that we acquired and operated for a while was Tech.mn. And so my podcast was the Tech.mn podcast. And after about 100 episodes of that, have recently stepped down and handed the hosting reins to another couple folks.
I love it. And just so I can get another plug-in for myself, I'm Tim Bornholdt. I run a company called the Mahonis Group. We build custom iOS and Android apps for businesses and startups. And I host a show called Constant Variables, and we take a non-technical look at what it takes to build and grow digital products. I also edit another podcast with a friend of mine, Carrie Tollefson, who is a professional runner, and we get to interview elite athletes, and that's a lot of fun. But nobody here is probably into that. It's just me being my nerd thing. So we're here to talk about marketing and technology. So Kevin, I want to start with you. You were fairly new to the Twin Cities when you began hosting the Tech.mn podcast. How did hosting a podcast get you acclimated to your new community, and how might businesses use podcasting as a strategy to get into new markets?
Yeah, for me, it was honestly a bit of a cheat code to get to know people in the business and technology community. Having come new to town, business is my hobby. Like I don't coach my kids' teams. I don't have a hobby. I just like geek out on business and technology, and I wanted to meet more people that had similar passions. And I had this opportunity to start a podcast, and so that was my personal win from it. I have since learned that that wasn't like a unique idea from Kevin. For example, I know somebody who sold a business and wanted to put his money and passion toward climate initiatives. So he starts a podcast interviewing experts in the climate realm and started building that network himself. And now he's raised a venture fund where he's actually financing climate initiatives. So I think just about any business, and some of the previous panelists had some great examples of, it doesn't have to be squarely in your field to tangentially benefit what you're doing professionally.
And I like that. I often say podcasting can be a good Trojan horse if you're trying to find your way into another industry or another business. It's a great way to come to somebody and say, hey, do you want to talk to me for an hour about so-and-so? It really does lead to some really good conversations and give you a foot in the door.
Yeah, and for me personally, I wanted it to exist. Like, I wish there was a podcast where I could have listened to a whole bunch of professionals and founders and technologists talk about their experience. So I just willed it into existence so that the next me could learn more about the Twin Cities, either having lived here or if they were moving here. And I've seen a lot of personal kind of unexpected benefit from doing it. But yeah, that was my experience.
And not to belabor the point, but I know a lot of times I hear people that are transplants to Minnesota, you can sometimes have a hard time finding a way into this community. It tends to be, hey, did you go to high school with so-and-so? So I think it's like another potentially perfect way to kind of build relationships and get to know other people.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting every person moving to the Twin Cities start a podcast, but it helped me meet more people fast.
It wouldn't hurt. There's all kinds of stories to be told. Ian, next question for you. There's a few different ways to produce a podcast. You know, we use a program that kind of records both ends locally, and then you put them together. It's what we in the biz call a double ender. But there's people that also kind of go over to studios and have them kind of get produced that way. So would you be able to talk about the benefits of working with a studio, kind of like Studio Americana?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the top benefits of that is, as they talked about in the previous panel, and anybody that's done podcasting knows, a lot of the nuts and bolts of it, the editing, making sure everybody's at the same level, everybody's on mic, the little ums, the uhs, the awkward moments, all that kind of stuff gets taken care of. When you're doing it in a studio, there's really none of that work on the back end because you have people doing all that for you. So I think it's, someone recently said to me, it's the best service for a podcast with a budget. So if you have a budget and you want to put your focus in the questions and the interviews and making sure that the show really reflects your character, taking out all the technical aspects of that can really allow that time for someone to do that.
There's a lot of different styles of podcasts that you can do, because you can do just a one-on-one interview, you can have a panel of guests, you can have kind of an NPR style, very well-produced story with lots of editing. Is there one format or another that's beneficial to go to a studio or to try to maybe tackle it yourself?
I think, I'll just very personal here, I would say they could all benefit from a studio at some point, but I think regarding the type of podcast people do, it's much more about the audience you're looking to seek. I think in the 5 years we've been running Studio Americana, one of the things I've found very starkly is that the more specific your topic is, the faster your audience grows, because specificity as opposed to broadcast is so important with podcasting. So whether you're doing, like you said, a one-on-one, whether you're doing a panelist podcast, the most important thing to think of is who's the audience that's listening to this, and is what we're doing connecting with those people.
Right on. Kurt, question for you. More and more podcasting platforms these days are coming out with video recording options, and you've been doing Schmidt List live for basically during the pandemic, going off on YouTube and LinkedIn. You're pretty much everywhere these days. Do you feel that video is now kind of table stakes for podcasting, and are you reaching different audiences as a result versus just having an audio-based show?
I wouldn't say, all podcasts should go to video, but I do feel like there's a connection that you get with the audience that's a bit different. I feel like podcasting has always been very intimate. A lot of times you're wearing headphones, you're alone in a car. But when you're watching a video, it's a bit more like a TV show, right? It's a bit more where you're not just paying attention to what they're saying, but what they look like, how their body movements are. It's a bit more engaged that way. So I wouldn't suggest, unless you're comfortable doing it. I always wanted to make video a part of the show, but the problem is that every time I set up cameras in the podcast studio, people would be like, what's going on? But thanks to the pandemic, nobody cares. Everybody's fine. Video? Sure, turn it on. What time? So I took advantage of that and was like, okay, and I always knew how to hack myself that if I made the podcast easy to produce, I would do it more regularly. So I would focus, like Ian was saying, focus on the content and not all the mechanics of it. So doing it live kind of forces me to just do it. I can't spend a lot of time editing it later when I do it live. So it forces me to get better at speaking, forces me to get better at producing the show. So I've really enjoyed it, and so I find that to your point about the audiences, yeah, it's reaching a completely different set of people than I would get traditionally with the podcast. In the last 4 months, we were just talking about that. I've been doing TikTok, and it's been great. Like the audience engagement there is fantastic, and it's people that are genuinely looking for content that they're just not getting other places. So it's been I really enjoyed it.
Do you think if you're starting a podcast that you should make the decision right away to do both video and audio, or do you think it's easier to start with one or the other?
Yeah, honestly, I would say just use your voice recorder on your phone and get started. Like, the more that you spend time, like, oh, what camera should I get, and all this other, if you focus on the content and what you're doing, it'll always be good. But if you have kind of a dream, it doesn't hurt to just set up your phone and record the video of it while you're doing it. So I would definitely suggest, if you're comfortable, do it. I find that especially with places like LinkedIn, video is just way higher engagement than any other thing that I've been doing. So I really enjoy the video part because you get so much more just overall interest. I get so many more people connecting with me. It's because it's like they see you, they're like, oh, I know this person. It's a bit more comfortable. So
Totally. Jenna, you seem to have your hand in every digital marketing space that there is. I mean, I see you everywhere. How do you see podcasting fitting in as part of like a company's marketing strategy compared to social media or email newsletters or blogging?
I think the biggest thing is that it's a different type of medium than video even, or just graphics. I was talking earlier, I think it's interesting. I think sometimes if you just put a picture up and you have words written, that's one way that somebody really likes, but then there might be someone who loves podcasts and they may have never heard of you because they're not on Instagram, or, so it's finding where your audience is, kind of like what Ian was saying, but also really focusing on differentiating what you're doing. So for me, one of the things I have worked on recently is YouTube, because it's something that I love, but also there's different people on there. All the people that subscribe to me are not following me on any other platform. So I think if it's finding a different audience, depending on what kind of content you're talking about, I think that there is so much potential also for repurposing content. So you can share, like when you guys were saying, that's actually what my podcast episode was about today, was repurposing content and sharing it multiple places. So for me, every time I come out with a podcast episode, I do share a clip, and I do use the Zoom footage, and I edit it, and I make a 1 minute for TikTok, Instagram Reels, LinkedIn, Facebook. I just share it everywhere. It's the same clip. And I know some people make multiple options. I just don't have time for that, so I just do the same clip. But people don't see it, unless they're on one platform. And everyone has a different platform that they use. Some people are really active on Twitter. Some people are really active on LinkedIn. Some people are really active on Instagram. So they might only see it one time. So that's kind of my answer for that.
Is there like saying that there's different situations that you would use, media, email marketing or blogging, there's all kinds of different applications. Do you think that there's like a handful of examples of what would be a good use case for using podcasting as your medium for getting your message out?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I wouldn't say it's directly going to get the ROI. Like some people are saying, it's more about building your personal brand. I think email marketing is great for selling tickets to something. I think blogging is great if you're trying to get someone to buy your course, because you got the link. Pinterest is great for traffic. Each platform on social media tends to have a different purpose, and I think that podcasting is really about connection with your audience and getting to know them. I was actually at a friend's house, and this girl recognized my voice. It was so weird. I'd never had that happen. And I think somebody on the previous panel said that too. And I was like, how did you recognize me? She's like, I listen to your podcast all the time. So it's like you do And also it's hard because you feel kind of lonely in podcasting. I don't know if anyone else feels this. You can't see your audience like you can on Instagram where people are commenting. So sometimes you feel like you're talking to no one and you see the numbers, but you're like, who is that? Who are these people? I can't really look and see who individually has listened. So I think being able to connect beyond the podcast on social, I always tell people, share your content as much as you're spending time making it, because that's how you're going to be seen.
I love that. It's really great advice. Jessica, Anna said, we talked a little bit before the show, and she said, you're really the mastermind behind getting the podcast for Women in Tech Twin Cities started. Could you share the story behind how it formed and why you decided you needed to do a podcast?
Yeah, well, it came about a couple years ago when I had switched companies. I had gone from a smaller company than where I'm at now, where everybody's kind of co-located in an office, to people being spread out across the country and in other countries. And I just really missed that conversation that I was having with women about their career stories, and realized just how important storytelling is, especially in my own career. I would listen to the stories of other women and how they, made their journey, and I would take pieces of that and use it to build my own career. And I was just really missing that, and so I reached out to Anna, and of course she jumped on board right away, and then we took a couple months to figure out what is this actually going to be, and maybe stressed over which camera and microphones we needed a little bit. But eventually I made my way to Women in Podcasting that was founded by Twyla Dang, and she gave really great advice. She said, like Kurt just said, just get going, just start. What are you waiting for? Just start. And that's kind of what we did, and here we are.
It is easy to get, you can just ask Kurt, I know how much he's invested in spending time fiddling with his setup, as we all have, but when you first started out the show, did you spend a lot of time thinking about, what kind of mics are we going to use? Where are we going to host it? How are we going to do it? What were some of the thoughts behind just, because it's easy to say, just go do it, but then it's how do you host a podcast? What's an RSS feed? All that good stuff.
Yep, so I did obviously spend a lot of time on Google researching. And I think the biggest challenge for us was we wanted to do something in person. So finding a space for us to meet and record together with the guest was a challenge. And for a while, we were recording at the library. And eventually, we rented some space at a co-working place to start meeting people. And then obviously, when the pandemic hit, we had to go all full Zoom. But yeah, we definitely, I think I came across the list and realized, some of the advice I got was don't invest in a ton in your microphones, and, spend your money elsewhere, basically. So, yeah.
Makes sense. Kevin, Tech.mn, as you mentioned, was recently acquired, so congratulations. But since you're no longer the host of a podcast, we probably should, show you.
I'll see myself out.
Yeah. Just kidding. I want to hear from your perspective. How did the podcast play into Tech.mn's strategy of growing it to a place where it could get acquired?
Well, I wanted to answer the question I just called Ian and I said it needs to happen. So Tech.mn, for those that don't know, it's storytelling online. And there was a component that was events, but that had kind of fallen off. So it was a really good blog, essentially, about tech in the Twin Cities. And being a podcast fan, I was like, we need to do more. We need to do more storytelling, tell more diverse stories, bring back the events, help to bring people together. And to me, podcasting was like a natural, of course, it's a great way to tell stories. It's a different thing we can sell, because we were selling sponsorships on the podcast. Thanks for being a sponsor, by the way, of 20 Minutes. And so for me, it was sort of an obvious, and I didn't acquire Tech.mn with the intent to sell it 3 years later, which is what happened. I just wanted it to continue to exist and to be even a better version of itself than it was. And so for me, adding a podcast was obvious. And I luckily had a woman named Jack on the team. And I said, Jack, we should do a podcast. And she said, let me do a bunch of research and figure out microphones. And then she figured out Ian's company existed. And I said, remove the excuses. Let's record next week. And so that's how we got started. And I do think, to answer your question, it makes Tech.mn a more, a better version of itself by being able to tell stories more in depth, by being able to give sponsors a different way to connect with the audience than just an ad on the webpage or just a sponsored post or something like that. Just like when events, started to become kind of a thing again, that to me was an obvious thing that we should get back into and give people an opportunity to connect with one another and give sponsors an opportunity to connect with our audience, which is really targeted and specific, like one of you mentioned before.
You mentioned that our company sponsored the 20 Minutes show, and it's the reason, the big reason we did it is because you are able to find that hyper-focused audience, and you're able to really get your message in front of specifically who you want to, and I think we kind of take that for granted with you can go on, it sounds trite because you can go on Facebook these days and type in, I want to target, 30-year-old women that are into this and into that, and you can get a hyper-focused audience, and there you go. So what's the big deal about podcasting is that you're able to get, you're in people's ears, and you're able to tell stories and really feel that emotion where, if I'm reading an article on tech.mn, I can kind of get emotion through it, and there's terrific writers, so don't get me wrong, I'm not throwing them under the bus at all. I just think with podcasting, you're able to bring those stories into a studio, and with just a voice, you can really hear the emotion and the struggles that people go through with building these big companies and successful enterprises.
Yeah, it's way more personal. To hear someone's actual voice, to hear the inflection in their voice when they talk about something that was maybe hard in their life or in their business is, you could write an entire book and not get that same personal connection of a, good, even a 5-minute storytelling session on a podcast.
Yeah. Ian, on that kind of same topic, I think there's, with podcasts, a lot of times, I don't know if anybody thinks podcasters make big bucks. Have you guys made millions off of your podcast?
I know there's one that makes big bucks, but
we
I'm
make the
not
medium bucks.
Yeah, that's the small to medium-sized bucks. But I think people can sometimes think about how do you make money off a podcast, and advertising is obviously one way to do that. What's your experience with all the shows that you work with them kind of finding sponsors for their show? What does that process look like for a lot of your guests or your clients?
To be really honest with you, disappointing. I think a lot of people when they come, and that's not true across the board, but I think a lot of people think of the old models of radio and television where I'm going to produce this product, we're going to get an advertiser that's going to give us X amount of money based on downloads. But as you mentioned, there's maybe 3 people making that kind of money in podcasting, and it's Joe Rogan, and it's Mark Maron, and pick your third. But I think where there's 2 big opportunities for people that want to get advertising in their podcast. The first is if you are doing a podcast that's very specific, that's on a specific topic, just like you did with 20 Minutes, it's reaching that specific audience. So if you can find an advertiser who really wants that audience, that is a great match for a podcast. And there isn't really an infrastructure behind that to say, well, here's the rate per download that you're going to do. It's more about a sales relationship with that person, and you can kind of work out what those deals need to be. I think the biggest generic way to have your podcast be a sponsorship is essentially how most people are using it, and that is the thought leadership and the brand awareness. And what I keep hearing in this panel and in the previous panel, and it's very true, is the personality that comes into podcasting. I heard Allie say they dumped one podcast because the person was very wooden. It didn't come across. There was no personality in it. And if you don't have a personality in a podcast, you may as well throw that episode away. But if you can present good personality and really show yourself and the people you're talking with as experts in the field, you're creating a lot more value on your brand. And I think that when you think about how am I going to get money out of podcasts, that's the way I think people should look at it.
Yeah, to underscore your point with targeted, so I mentioned earlier I edited a show about professional running. And
I did want to hear that show, by the way. I don't know why you don't think people want to hear that one.
It is a good show. I won't undercut myself too much, I suppose. But we do get advertisers on that show, and it's not, we're not making like Squarespace amount of money. It's not MeUndies or anything like huge sponsors, but we're getting sponsors that it's like they really want like this demographic of runners that might be interested in like a new foam rolling technique or sunglasses or like a nutrition. There's all kinds of ways that you can target it. If you have, I mean, the thing to underscore with all of it is you need to have good content and people listening to start with. But if you are able to draw in that audience and you are able to have the kind of guests that make people want to listen, then that's, I think, the best way to go about it is find those specific sponsors.
Absolutely, because and I should say that for the Casper mattresses and those kind of typical sponsorships you hear on the big sponsors, those advertisers are looking for anywhere from 10 to 100,000 downloads per episode. So if that's a reference for people at kind of where you need to be to get that sort of advertising. But as you say, if you have a sponsor that is a perfect match with the audience that you're speaking to, and you can show them, yes, we are engaged with this audience, there's a lot of value for them in that.
Absolutely. Kurt, you, on the flip side of hosting a podcast, you also appear on a lot of podcasts. I mean, that's how we got connected, was I had you on my show. So I'm really curious to hear how you fit being a guest, like how that kind of plays into your overall strategy of, I don't know what your strategy is, so I'm not going to pretend to assume
I don't know what my strategy is.
What is your strategy? No, how does being a guest kind of fit into helping get people maybe onto your show or help people find more about Foundry?
Yeah, the more people you can reach by going on other people's shows, the better, right? Because even though my show is mostly an interview style show, it isn't about me, right? It's about amplifying other voices. It's about celebrating those people and their stories, because I'm curious and I'm interested about that. But being able to take my personal story and take it on the road to other places gives an idea of what they're getting, because my show isn't called like the Twin Cities Leadership Central Podcast of America. It's just called Schmidt List, because my wife thought it was funny for me to call up people say, do you want to be on my Schmidt List? Like,
It's funny. She was right.
and it's memorable, right? But it is about, I mean, the underlying theme I'm exploring with the show is the idea of leadership without authority. That's what the show is really about. And being able to go on other shows and talk about all the different things I've learned from all the different guests is super gratifying. It's really fun. But yeah, you get to get out there and grab people and bring them over because they're like, oh, that's interesting. Because you usually don't end up on shows that aren't similar in some nature to your own. So you can introduce yourself to that audience. I think it's really powerful.
On the same note, how do you kind of balance being the host of your own show? You kind of, you get liberty to tell parts of your story, and it's like your audience, if they follow you through your whole, if they started early on, they kind of listen to a lot of episodes of you, they start to get to know, little personal stories about you that you kind of share on the show. How do you balance you kind of wanting to tell your story with, really the whole point of the guest being there is, like you said, to amplify them. So how do you kind of get that right down?
Honestly, a lot of the times when I'm talking to guests, I'm like, what have you been researching lately? What's at top of mind for you? That's usually what I base the show on. But if there's something where I'm talking with that person and we really connect on something, then I would say those shows just end up being more balanced because I'm sharing more of my personal story along with it. But the majority of the shows, I would say, is me learning from that other person. I've always joked it's free consulting. It's great. You can get some really expensive people on your show for free and ask them how they get stuff done, and they will tell you, and they don't charge you. It's fantastic. So that for me has been a big part of why I get excited about it, because it's my personal growth and then being able to share that. But yeah, there's just times when you connect with somebody who's either in the same field as you, maybe has the similar background to you, and you can just really go back and forth in sharing those stories. It's a lot of fun. And by the time you're done, you're like, wow, that was 30 minutes. It felt like 30 seconds. So
it's free consulting and free therapy half the time.
Oh, it's all therapy.
Jenna, you do solo episodes where you just kind of talk into a microphone and share your story and your knowledge. And again, in the biz, you'd call that evergreen content. You also do interviews though as well. So how do you what do you see as the value in one over the other?
So when I first started, it was almost all interviews. And lately, over the last, I would say, year, I realized that I don't get to share my expertise as much. And so there are some podcasts I listen to where it's just one person and I just want to get the information from them. And then there are other episodes where I listen to a lot of pop culture, podcasts where it's celebrities and they're talking about their lives. So I think it really depends on what you're looking for. And for me, one of the things I've realized is, I have a YouTube channel. I can literally record a solo episode and then also film it at the same time. So I'm able to make a 15-minute YouTube video and a 15-minute podcast at the same time. So that's something I've started doing to kind of lessen the amount of work I have to do. So that is one reason why I'm doing a lot more solo. Plus, I just feel like I have a lot to say. I mean, that's why a lot of people start podcasts is they want to talk and they want to, but I also think what you guys were saying about being able to meet people, it's a great way to get people to talk to you. You're right. Like, there's people that I look up to and I say, especially if they have a podcast, it's great to do a podcast swap. So I did that with Kurt. I went on his show, he came on mine. So like, there's a lot of ways that you can, collaborate with people that you maybe never would, and it's a great way to be like giving them something before asking. It's kind of being like, come on my podcast and then share your expertise with my audience. So.
One thing you'd mentioned earlier, and you kind of said it again, of how you record a 15-minute YouTube video and a 15-minute podcast at the same time. I feel like, again, this is like my Minnesotan showing, but I feel like putting my content out there, like on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, everywhere, I feel like I'm irritating people or I'm bothering them somehow. Did you feel that way? Do you still feel that way? And what, again, this is therapy. What advice can you give me?
More Jenna.
This is a really common thought, but what I learned very quickly, I did a poll, I did a Google form survey of my audience, and I asked them, did you know we have a podcast? And it was over 50% said no. So even though you think and I put out a post every single week on my Instagram. Every Tuesday I put out an Instagram post sharing the latest episode. And yet with the algorithms and all the things, you think that everyone's seeing your stuff, but they're not. So the more that you get out there, it also takes people 7 times to see something before understanding what it is. So I think that actually the more you put out, the more likely someone's going to actually see it. So I think that a lot of us get in our heads about oversharing when really it's actually not enough.
Yep.
It's good to know. Makes me feel a little bit better about oversharing.
That's very true.
Jessica, question for you. The podcast that you have is really impact-driven around inclusivity in tech and highlights some traditionally unheard voices in the community. For anyone that might be looking to start a show like that, where they're trying to amplify voices for people that might not be heard very frequently, I would imagine that might be hard to do. So I'm curious to hear what your strategy is for going around and finding guests to come onto your show.
So the biggest strategy really is for us is to just go out in the tech community and meet people. And also a big fan of, like everybody up here said, the guest swapping. That is a great way to meet people and kind of expand your audience as well. But mostly we're out in the community meeting people, listening to stories we think are interesting, and then kind of pulling them onto our podcast. And as well as Anna is like a great networker. She is the extrovert of our group, and she definitely does a great job of meeting people and pulling them in and from her network as well.
It's got to be nice being on a team of a podcast. I think the rest of us have solo shows. We have, I obviously, Jenny helps me out with pretty much everything, but it's got to be nice to have that team to be able to rely on, where you can bring your strengths and passions and let the more boisterous of us go out and strike up the conversation.
Yeah, Anna's definitely my people person. She's great at talking to people, and then I learn from listening to her talk to people, and as the introvert of our group, being able to learn how to talk to people has been one of my goals with starting the podcast. So getting to partner with her and see how she does it has been great. And I handle more of the the behind the scenes marketing stuff. I like creating graphics and that sort of thing. So.
Being that you are self-proclaimed introverted more so than the typical, I'd say, podcast host, have you found that yourself becoming more comfortable being on the air and being able to kind of share your story and help pull other people's stories out of them?
Definitely. I think it's made me more willing to do other things besides just podcasting. Like, I've been presenting at conferences and other things, and it even helps me in my job when I have to present to stakeholders and things like that, because now I understand what makes an interesting story and how to present that. So definitely very, very helpful.
That's awesome. I do want to give folks here a chance and online if you have questions of the panel. I feel like I didn't give enough time for that last time, so I want to, if anybody here is interested, has a question for our illustrious panel here, feel free. I know, Calvin, you had a question last time that didn't get answered.
My one? Oh, sweet. So we talk about being specific, right? And what would you guys say is the importance of having a title, a headline? I've been taught, don't bury the lead, right? So as we think about being specific, not only in, I guess, the overall content, but how important is the headline of that episode? And then how do you guys creatively, what's your creative process to make sure you have the right headline?
I can tell you my experience, and I do want to clarify, I had a co-host, her name is Jack. Hi, Jack, if you're watching online.
Feel bad now. How could I forget Jack?
She'll forgive you. Yeah. She's a nice person.
She won't forget. She'll forgive.
So Kelvin, we tried to just find interesting people and pull out their story, whatever that is. And Jack is the architect of this. The headline comes after. So like we might go into an episode or a conversation thinking like, oh, here's something that we think is interesting about this person, but the headline coming after it is like actually totally different than what we expected. So we kind of just stopped with the plan. We would just go in understanding enough about the person to be able to ask good questions, but not over researching, and just let people tell their story. And almost always, like we got pretty good at it, where like we'd make eye contact when somebody said something and just know, and like Ian's team would like hit a button or whatever they do, because we all knew that quote was going to be the headline. And I don't know, like somebody mentioned, like the analytics on podcasts are just like Stone Age. Like, does the headline help people click in and listen or not? I don't know, but for me, I think it's interesting to like give somebody a preview of what they're about to hear.
I think one thing, too, to add to that that's been helpful for us is transcribing our episodes, because then we can, see it in text and then kind of pull the headline out of the transcription. It makes it a lot easier.
And I would just add to that I think, having the key things of your podcast, the name of the guest, the topics that you're having, so that in a basic search engine, that could pop up as one of the results. So where people are looking for that person or that topic. And, and I see people make really fascinating, interesting headlines or titles for their episode, but it doesn't actually tell you much about what's going on in it. So I think a nice combination of the two, making sure that those keywords are in the title, are in the body of the description, and then you can have fun around that, is what I would say, which I think you guys did an amazing job of that at TechMN. So.
Yeah, you don't want to clickbait your audience because they will not listen to the whole episode. And you can actually track, I know Apple Podcasts has the opportunity to see what percentage of people listen through. And I think that when I first started my podcast, I just called it an interview with so-and-so. And then I realized after a couple of episodes, I was like, well, no one knows who they are. So I need to really focus on what the actual topic is about. And what you were saying about transcription, I use Otter, which is a great transcription tool. And what's cool is that after you put all of the stuff in, it actually tells you what are the most commonly used words in the whole, episode. So that way it kind of triggers my memory of, oh, what did we talk about and what is actually going to be talked about a lot. So the person that's listening will know from the title.
And we've had a few shows, that reminds me, we've had a few shows that publish day is the next day. They forgot to send description, title, like whatever. And that's exactly what I do, is I'll go through the transcription and I can write a title and description based on that and make sure we're publishing on time at least, so.
I think it's also important to have really good show notes and links and everything, so that you can also do like timestamps. There's a lot of different ways to kind of get people to be like, oh, at that point, I should listen through to that. So there's a lot of different ways to keep people engaged in the episode.
Here. Are there any other questions in the crowd here? Feel free to raise your hand. Got one over here.
So myself and my team, we've been playing around with this idea to start a podcast for a very, very long time, but we just can't find the will to make it a priority, but it's something that we really want to do. What was like the turning point for you to like actually like flip the switch and start your podcast?
Well, I know, again, back to hacking yourself. I was doing a lot of speaking events when I started the show, and so at the end of one of my speaking events, I just announced that I was going to launch a podcast in front of everybody, and half of me was like, "What did you just say?" And the other half's like, "Yeah, we're doing this." So for me, it was about one of the biggest things for me was when I first had the idea to do it, I went around and told all these people I was going to start this podcast, and a lot of people were like, "Cool," and I was like, and I realized I remember going home and talking to my wife and saying, nobody seems interested in this podcast, and she's like, "Are you waiting for somebody to give you permission to do this?" And I was like, "Yes, I'm waiting for somebody to say, yeah, you should do that. You should go and do that." I think for me personally, I'm not sure what you're struggling with exactly, but for me, I was waiting for somebody to tell me that I should do this, and I realized that nobody's going to do that. There's nobody waiting out there going, "Boy, I can't wait to hear more from that guy." What we need is another old white guy out there telling us some things to do out there. No, for me, it was more about going out and making sure that that I did have something to say, and I knew that these people had great stories to tell, and I wanted to be the catalyst to express those things. But for me personally, yeah, my biggest struggle in the beginning was waiting for somebody to tell me I should do it when I just had to do it.
For me, I started my podcast almost 5 years ago, and at the time I was, starting Twin Cities Collective, and it was something that I just thought, oh, I should talk to local people. That was just like my thought. I was like, this is what I should do, because this is kind of, podcasting was blowing up at the time, and I think something that I found was I went to film school, so I know how to video edit, and I'm like, it's half the work, because you only have to edit the audio. So I was like, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna try it out, and I didn't think it was gonna last. I thought it was gonna last 6 months, and it's been almost 5 years, so it's crazy.
And I would say something that Kurt said earlier, where it's, get out your phone and hit record on the voice recorder. Bring someone with you and sit next to each other. Expect that episode isn't going to go anywhere, but you've had the experience of doing that recording. You can listen back and say, well, here's what I like about it. Here's what we should do differently. And, there's one thing I subscribe to a little bit differently than some podcasters, which is I don't necessarily think you should put out your podcast to the public, just whichever one you do. I think you do want to have a good impression for people so that they come back and listen to more. You're fighting with 500,000, 3 million, 50 million different podcasts. So don't give people a reason not to come back, but do take all that time for yourself to learn what you like about your podcast and what it's going to become for you. And it probably will be a little bit different than what you think it's going to be when you start. And that's awesome. So that would be my thought on it.
One bit of advice I got from Ian actually was like, just do 10 episodes. You're not signing, and we ended up doing 100, but that can feel intimidating to think I have to do something every week from now until the end of my life. Like, nobody wants to sign up for that. But if you we'll do 10 episodes, that's not that intimidating, right? And then see if you like it, see if it's good, see if people are listening, and then you can commit to another season or another 10 or something like that.
And by the way, that's especially for companies that are looking to start podcasts, that's the exact advice I give people is think of it as a start and end. Think of it as a 6-episode arc. What do these 6 episodes look like? What guests would we want? What kind of themes do we do? Do it. Expect that to be the start and the end. And then when you're all done, and you can analyze and say, do we want to do more of this, or is this going to be the podcast? So.
Jessica, how did you finally make the leap? Because I know the podcast was your idea. What has you just kind of mulling it over for a while? I'm curious to hear what kind of made you finally jump off and do it.
I did a search for women in tech podcasts, and really I think I came up with 2 or 3 at the time, and they had only put out a couple episodes and then they were done. So at the time there wasn't a lot of women out there sharing their stories in technology, and I think that was the catalyst of we need to get out here. Anna and I have been in the diversity and inclusion, volunteering our time for a number of years before this, so I kind of feel like we have a lot of experience in that space and what people might be interested in learning about from our guests, and some of the struggles that they've had might be relatable. So just seeing that there was just so few women out there talking about tech was really the push to get going.
That's awesome. What other questions do we have from the crowd? Any? I've got lots of them, so I can keep going. All right, I'll ask another one. If you have another question, just raise your hand. We'll definitely get you to it. One question that I have, especially from a marketing standpoint, you got to always have like the ideal person that you're shooting for with your podcast and who you're trying to bring into your show. So I'm curious to hear from each of you. How do you keep your ideal listener in mind when you're recording your podcast? Do you do anything prep-wise to like kind of keep that in mind, or just what do you think about when you think about keeping your ideal listener in mind?
I know exactly who I'm talking to every single time, and it's very specific. It's a woman in her 30s. She's in a mid-management level. She has a team that she's accountable for, but they don't report to her from an HR function, and her boss doesn't know what she does and why she adds value. And I'm very specific targeting and who I'm talking to, and trying to communicate to, because myself personally, like a huge part of my audience, I mean, the majority of my audience is women in a mid-management level. And so for me, I'm trying to get out what I get back from them in terms of responses and questions, and trying to export those back to the show. So me, I've got a picture in my head of like who's sitting across talking to me every time. Now, did it start that way? No, it was about 30 episodes in when I finally got that picture in my head. But but eventually it comes to you.
I think for me, one of the things that happened was I recently changed the name of my podcast because I wanted it to be clear that it was about marketing, because for a while it was called the Twin Cities Collective Podcast. What does that mean? And I also got rid of the Twin Cities because I wanted it to be available to not just people because that does kind of minimize the audience, especially for a podcast. It's different than like local events. So I think one of the things I thought about was all the people who have come to my events or who do follow me on social, thinking about them and what questions would they want to ask the person. I think really putting yourself into the perspective of the listener, because I listen to podcasts, so I know I love when I listen to a podcast and they ask the question that I was thinking. So I think really thinking about, even if you know the guests really well, and that's another thing we haven't really talked about is like, it is easier to interview someone that you've met before. But I also think that, you coming to someone you've never met, brand new, it's literally like you're interviewing them and learning about them for the first time. So I think there's different types of guests that way, but I think really figuring out what does your audience want to hear and why are you even doing this episode? Why did you invite this guest? Why did you reach out to them? There must be some reason. And so I think getting to the heart of that is really important for the episodes.
I think when Kurt talked about having that very specific person in mind, I'm immediately thrown back to my radio days when I worked at a radio station who said, okay, this is very specifically who our audience is, and they taped a picture of a 37-year-old woman named Jennifer on the front of the screen at work. So all of us, when we were doing the show, always literally had her face in our mind as we did that, which, I mean, it was an interesting practice, and I think even more so for podcasting because of the specificity. I think broadcast was a little bit different, but I think that's a really good way to go about it. And something Jenna mentioned about guests too, I think when you talk about people responding to the podcast, getting good guests, getting more guests, making sure that every guest really felt like they had a good conversation, were heard, and were valued, that's going to make an incredibly good podcast as well. And that's also going to entice them to share it with their people. You can ask people to share and like and all that kind of stuff, but if you bring a guest on and they really feel like they were heard and valued and it was a really good recording with them, they're going to be energized to share that around and spread your community more.
I've also found that sometimes the smaller guests tend to share it more. If someone's on a podcast all the time and they're just like, it's just another podcast, they probably are less likely to share. But if it's someone's first podcast or they're just super excited to be on, they might have maybe a micro audience, but they're all going to be supporters of that person. So I think that's something a lot of people are like, oh, I got to get all the big guests. I find that the ones that are smaller tend to do better episode-wise.
For us, we think about the only. Are you the only woman in the room? Are you the only minority in the room? That's who our audience is. And we've kind of changed that a little bit this year we've started bringing allies and men as guests this season. But really, we're thinking about, are you the only? Because that's a lot of weight to bear when you're just the only one in the room.
I tended to not think about my guests at all, or my audience at all, for a couple of reasons. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and the ones that I like the most, it's where you can tell the host and the guests are just having fun and having a good conversation. And I don't think that person was envisioning me. They were just having a good conversation. Second, I didn't know what the audience was going to be. Like, I was new to town, and it turned out, it's called the Tech.mn podcast. All of our guests are from Minnesota. We literally ask, what do you like about Minnesota at the end of every episode? But only 70% of our listeners are in the state of Minnesota, which I thought was interesting. And the third reason, if I had pictured the persona of the person that I'm talking to, tech in Minnesota, it would have been a 30-something white dude in a hoodie. But we specifically wanted to tell stories that weren't just white dudes in hoodies, to your point. And so, it was a conscious decision to not picture this hypothetical audience that we were speaking to.
I'm on the same camp as you. Like, I've never had a laser-focused person in mind for the podcast. It's kind of like we talked about with Anna on the last session. I follow my curiosity, so my ideal listener is myself, and maybe that's like a selfish thing for me, and I've got a big ego, I don't know. But again, I think if you follow your passion and you follow your curiosities, other people are gonna kind of glob onto that naturally, and you kind of organically grow an audience. And as now we're closing in on 100 episodes, I think I have a better understanding of who my audience is as a result. But yeah, right at the beginning, even like Kurt said, now he has a laser-focused person. It's like, it's hard to get to that point right out of the gate unless you're, seasoned.
Well, he took 30 episodes to get there.
Right.
So that's the key, is I think, like exactly as you say, when you're starting out, when you're first doing it, I wouldn't recommend you're like, this is the person that's going to be our listener. I think what you're doing is the right way. Show the passion, have the conversation, have fun, because that's what's going to get anybody listening. If it's just, you're like, I am going to go for this person for my first episode, it might not turn out the way you want it to. So.
Yeah, I agree. And I know we are coming up on the end of our time. So I wanted to give you guys a chance. Should have done this on the last panel, but give one last chance to plug your podcast and how people can find more about what you guys are doing.
Well, I will just plug Studio Americana. For your podcast, we can do pretty much anything you want. We also do audiobook production, a couple of studios in town. We do things remotely as well. We do have a podcast called the Studio Podcast, which has just about 3 episodes if you want the nuts and bolts on how to get started, how to do a little bit of marketing, and you can find that all the popular platforms.
We got 10 seconds each, so
fire. I'm Jenna, and I run the Collective Marketing Podcast. You can find on all platforms. I also run Twin Cities Collective. Follow us on Instagram.
Just look for Schmidt List on Google. You'll find it. There's not a lot of other competition out there for that name.
You can find us at WIT Twin Cities or wittwincities.com. All of our episodes are up there, as well as on all of the platforms.
Yeah, Tech.mn podcast is now an asset of Beta, which runs Twin Cities Startup Week. And if you have not paid anything for the events and the experiences and the content of this whole week, you should feel bad about yourself, and you should go there and make a donation right now. Beta.mn.
And a huge thank you to Beta for putting on this event. Thank you all for showing up. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Twin Cities Startup Week this week, and thank you for coming.